Title of my presentation is Survival and Revival of Indigenous Taiwan in the post-colonial, post-modern, and post-tradition era. Next. Here is a framework of this talk about Indigenous Taiwan, from colonization to post-colonial, from modernization to post-modern, from tradition to post-tradition. The strive for sustaining indigenous peoples conserve the territories of life in Taiwan. This is an unequal and unbalanced historical process ongoing. Accepting, accepted, adapting, adapted, and assimilating, assimilated. When we look back to our colonial situation and the context, it may like the skeletal remains. Only if we could give them flesh, blood, and spirit by our thoughts and action. Next, please. About Indigenous Taiwan, it's all about the trinity of language, culture, and biological diversity. Next. This is a map about the diaspora of the Austronesian language family, which originated from Taiwan 5,000 years ago. It spans from Indian Ocean to the Pacific, go westward from Taiwan to Philippines to Borneo to Malay Peninsula and Indonesia, and from Borneo to Madagascar. Go eastward from Taiwan to Philippines to Micronesia, Melanesia, and to Polynesia, with Hawaii in the north. Aotearoa, New Zealand in the south, and the Rapa Nui, Easter Island in the east. It's one of the largest language family in the world, comprising more than 1,200 languages, second only to the Niger-Congo language family of Africa. Second, next, please. Next, please. This is a map of the Formosan languages. Taiwan has the highest language diversity in the Austronesian, with up to 20 ethnic language groups recognized by the linguists. They are indigenous peoples of the plains and the wetlands, forests and the mountains, coast and islands. There are still 43 indigenous dialects speaking by the 16 officially recognized ethnic group in Taiwan today. Next, please. From colonization to post-colonial, it's a historical process continuing from 400 years since the 17th century. Next. Very briefly, here is a colonization chronicle of Taiwan. Touches the Indian Company, 38 years. A Chinese wallowed Koxinga family, 21 years. Chinese Empire of the Qing Dynasty, 212 years. Japanese Empire, 50 years. Nationalist Chinese government, 76 years until now. It turns from exploitation to settler colonization very fast. In the period of the Qing Dynasty, came a large population of immigrant farmers from China. And in the period under Japanese Empire, when the total conquer of all indigenous peoples, and the starting of our modernization. Yeah, next please. This is a map to show how fast the indigenous people lost their territories within 300 years. In the top left, we are intact in the beginning of the 17th century. And in the top right, in the mid 18th century, 1/3 of Taiwan in plain areas is occupied by immigrant farmers from China. The bottom left map is after the cession of Taiwan to Japan in 1895. So in the beginning of the 20th century, indigenous people still have de facto control of more than half the areas of Taiwan. And bottom right, yeah, this is announced at 1928 and implemented in the 1930s. The state grabbing of all the common areas and territories of the people. It becomes the national forest and the indigenous reserves. Next, please. Map on left displays the distribution of indigenous peoples in 1930s. They were under the spatial administration arrangement and the monitoring by the police station. And it's the consequences of 160 battles between 1896 to 1915 between the indigenous people and the colonial government within 2 decades. And map on the right shows the minor changes or almost no little changes of the indigenous reserves since the 1930s to current day. Next, please. Next. Map on the left shows the indigenous peoples areas comprising of 30 mountain indigenous peoples municipalities and the 25 plain indigenous peoples municipalities. The plain one is marked with yellow-green. Then on the right side is a map met for the IUCN guideline. The governance of protected areas published in 2013. It where depicts the total overlapping of the national protected area system and the national forest with the inherent indigenous peoples conserved territories. Next, please. On rise of indigenous peoples, yeah, everything in the recent decades, everything starting from the deed of martial law in 1987. 38 years since 1949, one of the longest. Then, and this is a starting point of the waves of a social movement emerged since 1988. Then, by the strong campaign of Association for Rights of Indigenous Peoples, comes the amendment of a constitution recognizing the position of indigenous peoples in 1994 and in 1997. In between, there is a regulation for registration of indigenous traditional name in 1995. Before it, all indigenous people is given a Chinese name, to be registered. And the most important is the agreement for a new partnership between the indigenous people and the government of Taiwan in 1999. During the presidential campaign, and reaffirmed in 2002 after President Chen Shui-bian have win the election. It is important, or a milestone, because in the agreement, it recognizes the inherent sovereignty of indigenous people. It promised to concluding land treaty with indigenous people to return traditional territories and for the autonomy arrangements, but it never implemented, or it still wanted to be implemented. Then, in the second term of the President Chen, is the promulgation of the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law in 2005. Under this law, Basic Law is totally following the draft of UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but delete the article or the part on rights of self-determination of all indigenous people. So you can see the trend, and then in recent years, the first one in Asia, the formal apology to indigenous peoples by the president. Now is the President Tsai in 2016. And later in the same year, also the setup of a presidential office, Indigenous Historical Justice, Transitional Justice Committee, says 2016. But nothing everything is yet to come out. Next, please. Now comes what our action group is doing in the background of what I've shared. The Indigenous Peoples, Indigenous Taiwan Self-Determination Alliance, built up at 2019. And in 2020, we have issued a public statement on indigenous decolonization, sustainable self-determination, and inclusive new nation building. And we declared it when we visited the presidential office, September 14 last year, appealing for recognizing inherent sovereignty, returning of the traditional territories, and the reparation for persecution and destruction, and the restoration of integral tribal communities and beyond. One of the most important missions we want to communicate with the mainstream society and the government is liberating the colonial relationship between the colonizing settler peoples and the colonized indigenous people that has degraded and distorted our common humanity. I should also do part of what the plan of the alliance. We are implementing the 4 organizational lines for building the capacity of indigenous political entities and the community governing bodies. First, United Council of Indigenous Peoples Confederacies for negotiation with the government. The second, Allied Front of Tribal Communities for Sustainable Self-Determination. They are doing the joint declaration of territories and the mutual recognition of inherent sovereignty and equal occupation and de facto governance in their territories. The third, autonomous councils of urban indigenous peoples, women, and youth. The fourth, liaison office for inclusive new nation building together. Yeah, please. Next. Next page, please. From modernization to postmodern, the raw, the cooked, and the stewed. What is this? This is the raw, the cooked, and the stewed savages. It has been the official terms of Qing Dynasty government for the 3 categories of the uncivilized indigenous people. Strange metaphor, but thought-provoking. Next, please. You can imagine what a radical change within a few generations. And this is the first thing. From living indigenous people in Taiwan, from living on natural rhythm of ecosystem cycles to adapting to calendar schedules, clock time, and the paper money. And the transforming of our body, mind, and the soul through importing medical clinic, primary school, and church, Christian church to indigenous people areas since early 20th century. Next, please. Then we have reflect and done something survey on or self-assessment on dependency assessment to modern institution and infrastructure. The disturbed and collapsing tribal communities entrapped in modern infrastructure and institutions with little or no choice. Now we are weaving into the market and the money system, education and employment, urbanization and consumerism, healthcare and the social securities, tapping water, electricity, and other energy sources, transportation, telecommunication, and the internet access. Rapid growth of urban indigenous population in the last 50 years. Now, we estimate that 2/3 of indigenous people population go urban. And for the age of from 15 to 55, maybe as high as 80% or more go urban. The only space left for indigenous people has been the marginality to the global supply and the value chain. But it disappeared very soon. Say, electricity supply comes only after 1982 in the small island of Pongso. Road system to the mountain village, Smangus, have been linked up only in the early 1990s. But within 2 decades or 3 decades or 4 decades, yeah, every the community is, I say, is disturbed and collapsing. Next, please. Next. Situation along with the modernization. Actually, this is the same with all the other people. Industrial production of everything and the consumerism of our daily life, which are based on capitalist exploitation and extractivism that go along with corruption and destruction of a people and the environment globally. Global supply chain and value chain causing the collapse of local food chain and the community value way. And the tribal communities go through from a regional affluence to unnatural poverty, or only if you should abandon to insist and proceed about your tradition. Next, please. Rethinking and relinking. How could we involve and adapt besides and beyond the state and the market with a wise free association relationship with the dominant mainstream political and economic system? Think about a minimalist modern technological supporting infrastructure to the network of the territories of life with appropriate scale and scope. And let the intentional instead of indigenous or intentional community conserved areas embedded in the interspecies habitats become the alternative good living places on Earth, countering the urbanization and the consumerism trend of empty comfort and deadly efficiency in the postmodern era. Next, please. Next. From tradition to post-tradition, restoring in identity and integrity for surviving and revival. Survival and revival. Next. Language is critical. Language-based ontology and epistemology are the soils for our unique way of living and a world vision. inheriting by an oral tradition of the storytelling and the singing, chanting through generation. A cosmos creation and the world building by giving names, giving no names, forbidden to be mentioned, inconceivable, and by channeling. I just share the character of our ancestry. Mother tongue in family, communication language in all community affairs, and the multilingual ability of our younger generations. How can this be achieved? By the dictionary, grammar, and the textbook in the class, like we are learning a foreign language. And also we recently have been introduced to the Google Arts and Culture. They uses AI to preserve endangered languages called or La Ro. This is introduced by our youth, and I will take a look on it. Next, please. This is a drawing of revealing about the language diversity. You can see 0.2% of the world population speak 3,586 smallest languages. And then comes the 20.4% of the world's population speak the other 2,935 mid-sized language. And then the 83 largest language covering almost 80% of the world population. About 42% of language are endangered, more than 3,000 languages. And almost all of them are indigenous language. And from other sources, they're talking about half of the today's language will become extinct within next 50 or 100 years. Next, please. In the Alliance, we also have another evaluation about the health evaluation of indigenous conserved territories of life. We're looking community by communities on the community interspecies habitats integrity, rights institutions implementation, knowledge ethic vitality. For ethic knowledge, we mean traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous local knowledge, along with the land, ocean ethic, as an holistic and multidimensional living tradition of a belief practice. The last one is livelihood, well-being, sustainability. This is not only for evaluation. This is also actually the guidelines for our community self-strengthening program. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, this one. Resurgence in our daily life. We are promoting 4 daily works in tribal communities. Resume the exercise of inherent sovereignty. Strengthen the traditional community governing body on environmental governance and resource management through adaptation and innovation, and also with negotiation and coordination. Restore the ethic influence and effectiveness of a social and cultural institution without replaced by the modern administration from government, and pass on indigenous living knowledge system of community embedded in the interspecies habitats to future generation. Next. Sustaining indigenous peoples conserved territory of life. This is about embeddedness and connectedness. Yeah, restore the embeddedness and connectedness. For this exchange, from early this year, we have mentioned about the exchange and the collaboration on discourse and the practice about the inherent sovereignty of tribal communities exists before any state region, and is based on maintaining the rights of nature in our interspecies habitats for all beings around us. Indigenous decolonization, countering the myth of an unified nation state, would evolve into a pluralistic knowledge and a legal framework for natural and cultural diversity and complexity. Strive for sustainable self-determination and inclusive new nation building for conserving the trinity of language, culture, and biological diversity. Indigenous rights and customary institutions are based only on the tribal community connected to and embedded in their interspecies habitats, cross generation. It is the territories of life. Next, please. Next. Yeah, the last one. Yeah, I have it. Oh, next page, please. Last orienting questions to our co-presenter and to our audience. How could the indigenous communities keep or restore their identity and integrity in their traditional living space and the spiritual territories, besides and beyond the state apparatus, and within and without the global market system? Does our embeddedness and connectedness that is deep-rooted in the natural environment and the interspecies habitats make our ultimate resilience or become our fundamental vulnerability? Let's rethink it from our living tradition of adaptation and innovation that has gone through radical changes across generations and through millennia. Next. Unutan de fokua no savalanyo. Follow the flow of your irrigation channel. Ayoi. Many thanks and the best wishes. Yeah, finish my presentation.